Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be covering the Forge Worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus, what they give you, a little bit of their fluff, and what their core units are. To begin, a little disclaimer, there are two different meanings to the word Forge World when talking about Games Workshop and their miniatures. The first is Forge World, the company that makes several different units, including a popular unit known as the Assault Drill, which can be played in the Adeptus Mechanicus 40k. In this video, we're not talking about the company, rather we're talking about the Forge Worlds, as in the worlds that you can pick from within the game in order to enhance your army. The first question we have to ask us, what do Forge Worlds give us? When you select a Forge World, you generally get 5 special things. The first being is a special dogma, the second being a canticle, the third being a stratagem, the fourth being a trait, and the fifth being a relic. In some cases like Mars, you'll get a special unit in Belisarius Call. Inversely, in some cases like the custom Forge Worlds that you can pick from, you only get the dogma, so you give up all the other options. That doesn't mean that the custom Forge Worlds are unplayable, as they actually get a super powerful dogma to compensate for the missing canticle and the missing stratagem. Additionally, for the most part, the traits and the relics are not particularly useful, and as such, it's easy to forgo those items. Before we go too far, I understand that I've just mentioned a whole bunch of terms that might not make any sense to a player who is not familiar with the game or is new to the Admech, because they are terms that are kind of specific to the Admech in themselves. So let's break down some of these terms to better inform you on how some of these aspects of Admech play out. The first term I mentioned was the dogma. The dogma is a universal buff that is given to all units within the selected Forge World as long as all units within a detachment are of that specific Forge World. What this means most of the time is that this is just a static buff to enhance your units. Sometimes you get more than one buff, such as in the custom Forge World option, while on the regular Forge Worlds you only get one special trait from it. The second term I mentioned was a canticle. Normally a canticle is an ability you pick once every turn. You have to pick a unique one every turn or you roll for it. There are different ways of modifying the canticles, but that is a topic for a later discussion. The canticle is a universal buff that lasts for the battle round and then changes when a new one is selected. The primary Forge Worlds have the option of selecting a special canticle and replacing one of the 6 options in their list with their special canticle. Usually the special canticle has a rather strong ability that gives your troops a super buff. Considering one of the normal canticles is incredibly weak, that's usually the one you replace anyway in order to make your army significantly stronger. A stratagem is an ability you can activate by spending command points, and command points are a resource that you begin the game with a certain quantity of, and you generate more throughout the game by various means. There are plenty of different stratagems in the Admech army that are universal to the army as a whole. However, every single Forge World gets a special stratagem option, and some are better than others, obviously. A Warlord trait is a special trait you can give to your Warlord and other characters by spending command points. Normally, when you pick a Warlord trait, you pick from one of the Holy Order Warlord traits introduced in Engine War because they are significantly better than any other options. However, there are some options within the core book that might be useful from the different Forge Worlds within it, though most of them you'll only be taking as an extra option by spending command points, not something you'd normally take on a Warlord over Holy Order Warlord traits, which can only be taken on your primary Warlord, and you cannot spend command points on taking extra Holy Order Warlord traits. And finally, the Relic is the last item you get for a special item as a Forge World. The Relic is kind of like a piece of war gear that your Warlord can carry, and you get it for free, so you might as well make the best of it. Most relics are not that impressive, but a couple of them do put in some work, and they're not a bad choice at the end of the day, considering that most of the generic ones that are outside of the Forge World are nothing to write home about. To conduct a discussion about Forge Worlds, I'd like to present them in the order that I believe is best to worst. This does not mean that any of the ones on the bottom of the list are unplayable unless specified, or that you have to restrict yourself to any of the top Forge Worlds. It just simply means that the ones listed first are more optimal than the ones listed last, mostly because their abilities are universal, or the benefits you get from choosing that Forge World are significantly better than the other options. However, this is all based on current tournament lists, and this is very early in the 9th edition, so things can change greatly, and there's always an aspect of fun of bringing a less known Forge World and breaking it, as one of the lists I will mention in this video actually surprised me with one of the choices it made and put a Forge World I would normally not really consider higher on the list than I would normally put it, and because it was that interesting of a use of mechanics that I would normally not think of myself. In the number 1 slot, I think the best Forge World currently is the Data Horde custom Forge World that is available in Engine War. The lore for the Data Horde Forge World is actually rather scarce because it is a custom Forge World, and really the name says it all. They hoard data, Whether it's Admech data or Xenorite data, it doesn't really matter. They love it all, and they'll hoard it, kind of like a dragon. So what is the primary unit of the Data Horde Forge world? Well, it's actually the Catapharon Breacher. And this is what really makes them shine, is the fact is that when you take the Data Horde Forge world, you get your primary stat, which gives a Feel No Pain to your vehicles. A Feel No Pain save is basically a save you make after all other saves to negate wounds. This in itself is not particularly great in terms of Forge world dogmas, because at the end of the day, a 6+ Feel No Pain is not that impressive, but it's a nice extra bonus. What really makes the Data Horde Forge world shine is a secondary option you can pick from a list, as you can with any custom Forge world, and that is the Transnode Arc Weapon buff, which gives you the ability to score an extra hit whenever you roll a 5 or a 6 when shooting with an arc weapon or attacking in melee with an arc weapon. To explain why the Trans Arc Node buff is so powerful is in a squad of 5 breachers, you'll normally get 10 shots, and half of those shots will hit. However, once you buff them with this Forge World secondary, when you fire those shots, on average you'll score an extra 3 hits. In other words, it counts as almost having 3 extra breachers in your 5-man squad. That is an incredibly powerful buff on what's normally a rather strong weapon known as the Heavy Arc Rifle. This buff also extends into melee, as breachers are armed with arc claws as one of their options. When you do the math on a 5-man squad when considering melee, you get 5 hits instead of 3 like in shooting, which is actually only slightly better than the shooting buff. However, it makes breachers a significantly more important melee threat when normally they can be locked up into melee, and if you consider the damage that either their heavy arc rifles or heavy arc claws can do against vehicles, it becomes rather insane. More so, you can make breachers a lot more tanky by taking a Holy Order Warlord trait that gives them a 5+ Feel No Pain, that gives them both a strong normal save, invulnerable save, and a Feel No Pain, and as such, they become very difficult units to take off the board for your opponent. In other words, you build a very simple army using this Forge world, where you end up taking whatever HQ choice you prefer, giving it learnings of the generator, which gives you the Feel No Pain option on your breachers, then taking the secondary buff that buffs your arc weapons, and taking as many 5-man squads of breachers as you can. The reason you're taking 5-mans instead of 6-mans is because of the blast weapon protection you gain from it, as blast weapons get bonuses against 6-man or larger squads, and as such, you can basically spam one unit and do very well. More so, you throw in any vehicles that you want to give a Feel No Pain to that would not benefit from other Forge worlds. Normally, when you take a Data Horde Forge world, you're taking it alongside one of the other Forge worlds in order to make a split list. So while the Data Horde Forge world in itself does not have a lot of variety, it's a very easy list to play, and it has a very powerful troop option that provides exceptional firepower and survivability that can be slotted into many other lists. So while in itself it is not very customizable because of how the dogma works, it's very easy to take either a patrol detachment or a large detachment, throw in as many breachers as you can, and add it to any other list. Being able to slot into multiple different lists by joining other Forge worlds is a great benefit to this army because it's incredibly powerful and it's very easy to play the Breacher spam list, even though the Breacher spam list might not be optimal. And while some might think that being easy to play is not exactly a benefit to it, when you consider tournament play and you're playing for 8 hours plus, it's nice to have a section of your army list that's not exactly difficult and requires a lot of choices in comparison to a lot of other Forge worlds and how you use stratagems and other such things to manipulate the field. Sometimes it's nice to just have a unit that can do a lot of work, be very resilient to damage, and simply put out a lot of damage on its own. The number 2 slot for Forge worlds goes to Mars. Mars is the homeworld of all Admech pretty much, and all of them wear some level of red to pay homage to Mars. And as you'll come to see, Mars can probably compete for the number 1 slot very easily against Data Horde, and really the only reason Data Horde beats out Mars is simply because of how easy it is to slot into other lists without any conflict. Unlike all other Forge worlds, Mars gets a special unit that no other Forge world has access to. This special unit is Belisarius Cawl, who's currently the High Forge Master of Mars. Many people make the wrong assumption that Belisarius Cawl has to be the warlord when chosen within a list. However, that is not true, and many times you don't actually want to make Belisarius Cawl your warlord because he can't carry Holy Order Warlord traits, as he's required to take the basic Mars trait when picking a trait. In other words, you can have an Engine Seer bossing around Cawl who is 10,000 years old. Why does the Engine Seer get to be the warlord and not Cawl? Well, I guess he's seen a lot of engines or something. I don't know. So what does Cawl bring to the table that other units don't? Call in many cases is actually a super Dominus, where instead of rerolling just ones in the shooting phase, he can reroll anything he chooses. This is incredibly good for buffing all of our shooting units because Admech does shooting incredibly well. The other thing Call does is he lets you add or subtract 1 from the dice roll when rolling for random canticles, as canticles can be selected randomly every single turn by rolling for them, which plays very well with the Mars Dogma, as the Mars Dogma says that you roll 2 dice instead of 1 when randomly selecting canticles for your turn. As you're rolling 2 dice and you're able to modify each by adding plus or minus 1 to each of your rolls, all of a sudden you get very high consistency in getting the canticles you want, which is especially good because Mars has a special canticle that gives +1 strength to heavy weapons. And seeing as there are many heavy weapons within the Admech army, this works very well with them. And this makes for a great segue into what the primary units are of the Mars Forge World. The 2 primary units of the Mars Forge World are Autocannon Iron Striders, which have seen a lot of popularity within 9th edition, and Castellan Robots. The reason Autocannon Iron Striders are so good within Mars is that because not only do they have reasonably good shooting to begin with, giving them +1 strength bumps them up to 8 strength, which means that they're wounding on 2s against toughness 4 units and wounding on 3s against toughness 7 units, which is Marines and tanks for the most part. In addition to that, Call provides them with rerolls. And why Castellans? Well, Castellans can provide an enormous amount of shots, each single Castellan putting out up to 18 shots depending on how you set them up, so having the ability to reroll is especially good. More so, what benefits both Autocannon Iron Strider and Castellans is the Mars Stratagem. For 1 command point, you can have every single unit on a 6+ score an additional mortal wound. This means when you're firing 18 shots, you will on average get 3 additional mortal wounds per Castellan robot. So not only are you getting an insane amount of firepower to begin with, you're putting out additional mortal wounds on that unit with Wrath of Mars. This is why a lot of times when you see people playing the Mars Forge World, they'll play it as a Call Castle. A Call Castle centers around building a fortress of different heavy firepower around Call, using him to buff it, and then nuking things off of the board. This has fallen out of favor slightly in the new edition because of how aggressively you have to fight for objectives on the board as opposed to blowing your enemy off of the board and then securing them. However, it is still very possible, just in a more subdued way, where you take a smaller castle and have some units to run up and secure the board, probably in a different Forge World than you're bringing Call, as Call is still very good. The Dogma is still perfectly fine, the Stratagem is still great, if not better, and the new Canticle from Engine War is exceptionally good as well on a lot of the units. Moving on to the 3rd slot, we come to Stygies VIII. Who are the Stygies VIII? Well, they're an interesting Forge World because they have a lot of secrecy, like most Forge Worlds, but they're different in the sense that they like Xenorite technology. What is a Xenorite? Or what is Xenorite technology? Well, normally liking alien technology gets one to be viewed as a heretic within the Empire. However, the Admech are very rebellious in how they view what technology they like and accept, with the Xenorites being an exceptionally rebellious sect who believe that alien technology is great and they love to study it. So Stygies VIII tends to be the outcast, in addition to being a little bit heretical in the past. The key units of the Stygies VIII are actually the Dune Rider, Fulgurites, and almost anything else that wants to either be far away or very close by. The reason for this is that the Stygies Dogma gives -1 to hit to any enemies outside of 12 inches, and the lore behind this is that it's alien gemming technology that they deny even exists. Why does this benefit so many different units? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Anything that wants to shoot at them without getting a -1 modifier has to be within 12 inches. Anything that wants to be close up and personal, like the Fulgurite Priests, gets to get a little bit of extra protection while getting in range to charge. Additionally, anything that wants to hang back and shoot gets to stay back and gets an extra little bit of a buff. So it encourages opponents to get close up to you so that your Fulgurites and other such units can get into charge range. In addition to that, the Stygies have an interesting stratagem that allows your units to infiltrate within 9 inches of your enemy. This means that you can get certain units in very close and personal very quickly. However, this has to be done first turn, which could potentially expose those units to heavy firepower if your opponent is smart. The special canticle is a fallback and shoot canticle, which isn't bad, but it's nothing particularly great compared to some of the other canticles available to the core Forge Worlds that are not custom Forge Worlds. The special relic is alright, as it generates random mortal wounds when within close combat. While this is nothing to write home about, this is a perfectly fine free bonus to whatever your warlord is in the off chance that he finds himself in close combat. Most of the time it's not going to do anything, but sometimes it could provide a little bit of extra damage. How useful is this? Well, I'm sure you could probably find something a little better. For the most part, our relics are weak enough that this might actually be an okay consideration in some lists. In the past, you'll probably hear that people talk about Dragoons being particularly good Stygies units. While this was true and you could still stack the -1 debuff to hit, that wasn't the only change made to Dragoons that made them fall off, as their taser lances were also nerfed significantly, and as such, at this point, the Dragoons are not in a particularly great spot. They still might be playable, and they still might be okay, but when considering the points cost and the damage output after all of the nerfs that the Dragoons received, the Fulgurites are probably simply a better option. This is what makes them the core unit of Stygies, where in the past many people would have probably considered the Dragoons a better option due to the infiltration, stacking modifiers, and the general powerful output of the Dragoons that has since been changed. Coming in fourth is my personal favorite Forge world, which is Lucius. Lucius is a Forge world that surrounds the sun and drains energy from it, using that sun's energy to create armor, weapons, and power its war efforts. Additionally, they employ the Zap Brannigan tactics of sending troops into killbots until the killbots reach their kill limit. What do I mean by this? Well, in one situation, while they were being invaded by Tyranids who were consuming everything, the tech priests hid underground and sent troop after troop to die to the Tyranids, and once those troops would die and get eaten by the Tyranids, they would send reconnaissance drones to pick up the different mechanical parts of those troops, bring them back, modify new troops, and then keep sending troops until the troops were too mechanical for the Tyranids to eat, and they somehow managed to push back the Tyranid wave. So let's talk about Lucius. What makes me like them so much is that they're kind of an all-around good Forge world where nothing really carries them on its own, but everything kind of plays a little bit of a role. Their dogma isn't particularly great, as it only affects units that have a -1 AP modifier and turns them into 0 AP, so it does not affect anything with a -2, -3, or any other version of that. Yet somehow this is still just okay, because when you think about it, there are a lot of units that randomly have -1 AP that gives you a little bit of extra resilience against them. Just in our army alone, if you look at it, the Breachers have -1 AP on their Arclaw, the Iron Striders have -1 AP on their autocannons, the Scorpius Belisarius cannon has -1 AP, the Taraxi Sterilizers have -1 AP on both their melee weapons and their ranged weapons. I just mentioned some of the best units in our army who were all featured in previous Forge worlds that were above Lucius that all have -1 AP that Lucius benefits from as a world buff. Moving on, the Stratagem for Lucius is a much bigger deal than the Dogma, as what it allows you to do is put units in reserves and teleport them onto the field 9 inches away from enemy units anywhere you would like for 1 command point. Why is this important? Well, while you can normally put units in 9th edition into strategic reserves, unlike strategic reserves, which scales with the power level of the squad you're putting into reserve, this lets you do it for 1 command point and it gives you more versatility. This brings us to what are the key units of Lucius. They are the Castellan Robots and the Corpus Carry Electro Priests, maybe Cataphron Destroyers to a lesser degree. The reason for this is that Castellan robots can put out a lot of firepower, but they can be vulnerable to shooting sometimes. And Corpus Carry priests can put out a ton of firepower and a lot of damage, but once again, they do not have the best saves and need to be within a very short range to get their electro gauntlets off. Destroyers, on the other hand, are fragile and benefit the Castellan robots, so they're kind of a toss-up at this point. However, maybe the Graph Cannon Destroyers are cheap enough to use. Now looking at the Corpus Carry priests, their save isn't particularly the best, but the Lucius Special Canticle gives them the ability to get +1 to their invulnerable save, which brings them down to a 4+ invulnerable save, which makes them significantly more resilient than they otherwise would be. There is something to mention about the Lucius Invulnerable Save Canticle is that it can only bring a unit down to a maximum of a 4+ save and cannot go to a 3 or 2+ invulnerable save. Yet there are a few tricks you can do with this, considering that when you read the Aegis profile on the Castellan robots, it doesn't actually reduce their save, it adds 1 to the save roll. So while the Castellan robots are in the Aegis protocol, what happens is that they go from a 5+ invulnerable save against shooting to a 4+ invulnerable save, and then you add 1 to the roll, so effectively they have a 3+ invulnerable save without breaking the rules of the Lucius Canticle. Then we turn our attention to the Lucius Relic, which is called the Solar Flare. The Solar Flare is a relic that can be used once per game to move your warlord anywhere on the board 30 inches from where they're currently positioned. This means you can take something like a Manipulus, use its +1 movement buff to move units in the movement phase, teleport it to a unit of Corpus Scary that just teleported in, shoot, then give them the Manipulus buff to charge in. Or you can teleport a Dominus and give them an extra reroll on their shooting. Once again, it's not an item that's particularly broken in itself, but it's an item that gives you a lot of mobility and versatility to move around the board. And finally, we come to the Lucius Warlord trait, which is nothing to write home about, as all it does is give +1 to the invulnerable save of the character who has it. I don't think this is particularly worth taking. Obviously, it's not worth taking over the Holy Order Warlord traits, but it's something you can maybe pay command points to take on other characters just to give them a little bit more resilience. Maybe there's a time you want to use it, but it seems a little bit too weak. But that seems to be what Lucius is. Everything seems a little bit weak on its own, but everything still plays a part, and everything has a little bit of a marginal utility. So all in all, it adds up and makes Lucius actually a pretty strong contender when you consider everything together as opposed to individually like you do with some of the other Forge worlds where one thing really shines and where other things are a little bit on the weak side. I'd like to end the video here as it's gotten rather long, and I think I can make a second video to cover the remaining Forge worlds because these are the ones that you will generally see being played in tournaments at this current time. And I'd like to stress again, just because I didn't mention a Forge world in this video does not mean it's not tournament playable. It simply means it's not currently popular. And in the next video, I'll talk about some of the other Forge worlds and how one of them has seen a bit of tournament play that has surprised me and made me consider a few new tactics that many of you might have not considered either, and I think that'll be the thesis of the next video, and that's partially why I think this is a good place to cut the video, because the next one can better focus on some theory crafting versus what's already tournament viable. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and as always, if you like the video, please like and subscribe for future content as it really helps a new channel like mine. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.